This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
The sound of praise for your Sunday morning.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Introducing Reverend A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center.
Was the son of a preacher man.
And Rabbi Joseph Potasnik of Religion on the Line.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Now, on Talk Radio 77 WABC, here's the Rev and the Rabbi, where faith matters.
Good morning, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Rev, I know you're recovering from your overnight stay at Times Square, being there all night, watching the drop ball. That was quite a moment.
You know, my wife and I did that many years ago when we first got married. I won't give the exact date, but and we experienced it, and it was quite an experience, but not one that we look to repeat. It was like, been there, done that.
Well, maybe it was preparation for some people for marriage, because they let you in, but they don't let you out. So
that's true. Watch it.
Anyway, much to talk.
So where do you want to start?
Well, you know, years ago, first became a rabbi, I met President Jimmy Carter. He came to the centennial of the New York Board of Rabbis. Years later, but he asked me, by the way, in our conversation, he said, so what do you want to do as a rabbi? I said, well, just becoming a rabbi, I want to try to bring people of different faiths together, and I'm a child of survivors, Holocaust survivors. I want to stand up whenever possible for the state of Israel and Jewish people. He said, I hope you succeed. Years later, I was at the White House when they had the celebration of the Camp David Accord. And I said to him, I spoke to you years ago. I wanted to do this. I remember you. Okay. Push forward. Ed Koch is mayor and presents the president with a letter of protest about his treatment of Israel, prejudicial. Years later, the president writes articles, comes out with a book, Peace or Apartheid, and blames Israel for the terrorist attacks, that Israel is not doing enough, and that's why you're getting the attacks. That was a justification for terrorism. Years later, of course, no longer president, and building housing for the poor. So looking back, for me, mixed. Some good things, some bad things, but you can't deny that he served his faith, his family, his country, but mixed reviews.
Yeah, and that's the reality, because you're not alone, Rabbi. I mean, many of the conversations out there have been mixed reviews. And some people just outright hate him. They think he's the worst president we have ever had. Right. One term. But look, you mentioned the Camp David Accord. That was a major accomplishment. The Panama Canal treaties were another. Some disagreed with that. Now we're revisiting that because we feel that China is controlling the canal in some ways, and that's going to hurt us. And he pardoned all Vietnam War draft evaders. Remember that?
Right.
So it's a mixed bag of what he accomplished and how people feel about him.
I don't think you have to give undeserved praise to someone. I think you have to be honest in your characterization. I think people expect that of us. I know sometimes when a person leaves this world, all the encomia are conferred upon the person, only the good things. But I think we have a responsibility to tell the truth. And if that's the way we feel, then why shouldn't we be able to state that? So,
I like to consider the context, Rabbi. I mean, the last 2 years of his presidency, he'd had to deal with the Iran hostage crisis. That didn't work out well.
No, and also the downfall of the Shah.
Right. Then the energy crisis.
Yeah.
You remember what we were paying for gasoline? It was crazy.
Inflation. Yeah.
So
a lot of negatives
office,
on that record. The report card doesn't have a lot of A's on it. When it came to building for the poor, Habitat for Humanity, that was more as an ex-president than a president. But I thought with Israel, there was this hostility that was evident, and that did not sit well with many of us who love Israel, don't say Israel's always right, but we thought he was grossly unfair in his treatment of Israel.
Yeah. And it's tough because you never know when you're elected official, right? You win the election and you go into office. I don't care whether it's mayor of New York City or president of the United States. You never know what crises are going to emerge while you're there. You don't plan for that. They happen, but then you're judged by how you deal with it.
Yeah. And what are your core principles? What are your core principles? That's always something to look at. Looking at the events of this past week, we've seen a terrorist attack now.
Terrorist attack, yeah.
10 people killed. Person allegedly radicalized. And we've seen in Europe these kinds of terrorists.
Actually up to 15 now,
15
Rabbi.
now.
15 people,
And, I always ask this question. Who knew about it? And when do they know about it in terms of the radicalization, in terms of the change of behavior? And that applies in a host of stories. The person who was responsible, or allegedly responsible for the murder of the CEO of United Healthcare. People around him didn't see any changes. I mean, is everybody just blind to this? The person who pushed somebody off the track just the other day, didn't someone see that this was a person who was very, very disturbed, had a host of, encounters with the law, I think went to jail? Where are we when these things happen?
Well, I'm glad you bring in the mental health piece, because with this most recent attack in New Orleans, right, they're looking into a history that he had. I mean, 'cause he had a great job. He was in IT. He served in the military and worked for the military. And all of a sudden he gets divorced and economic collapse happens in his personal life. And all of a sudden, he gets to a place where first, according to the reports, he was talking about taking his family out, killing his family. And somewhere along the line that shifted and he decides to do what he did, taking the lives of innocent people. Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
But why radical Islam?
investigate
We've seen this recurrent theme. We had Dr. Zuhdi Jasser on the program. Why do they turn to this radical kind of behavior with Islam? And where are the people around him when this kind of change happens?
Yeah, we as human beings, we play the blame game. So, what can I blame how I feel on? Who can I ally with to justify the actions that I'm going to take in response to my feelings? And, it happens. I'm curious to know just the degree to which he was radicalized, or did he use that as a justification? And maybe he does. Maybe he was radicalized. I don't know.
We're going to go to our guest soon, but I just want to make this point here. There was a woman who was burnt to death on a subway train.
Oh man, that was awful. Yeah,
and I thought to myself, people had enough know-how to take pictures of it, the video of it, but no one walked over and said, "We got to put this flame out."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You can take the video, but you can't, remove the flame. That was very disturbing. Okay.
That's a tough one, but it speaks to our society where we are, right? Record first, help later.
Yeah.
We've got a guest.
We do have a great guest, and that guest is Thomas P. DiNapoli, the Comptroller of the State of New York.
Yeah, so stay tuned for an incredible program ahead of you right here on the Rev and the Rabbi, 77 WABC.
Eden Memorial Chapels understands Jewish funerals can take many forms. Some are Orthodox, while others are more conservative or of a Reformed nature. There's no one better. With services close to all New York and New Jersey cemeteries, Eden Memorial Chapels offer fair and balanced pricing and can provide easy transfer of you and your loved ones to Israel. While you're grieving, they're here to take care of all the details so that you deal with less bureaucracy and have more peace of mind. Go to EdenMemorial.com. That's EdenMemorial.com.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner. However you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running's all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
Reverend Bernard, we are privileged to have with us someone who is respected by people on different sides of the aisle. That's a rare status to have. But Thomas P. DiNapoli, the Comptroller of the State, has enjoyed that for many years, and we're very fortunate to have him with us. First question is, Comptroller, do you know that since this is called the Rev and the Rabbi, if the Rev does not claim his unclaimed funds, it automatically goes to the Rabbi?
No, that's not true. No, that used to be the case, and then we discovered what you were doing. We changed
I thought anything he doesn't claim goes to the Rabbi. That's why we call it the Rev and the Rabbi.
Please clarify, Controller. Thank you.
By the way, is it Comptroller? What's the preferred pronunciation?
Well, I always say it doesn't matter as long as DiNapoli is the next word after. It is technically spelled C-O-M-P, coming from the French for computing, but most people actually pronounce it controller. But technically it's C-O-M-P, comptroller.
All right. Yeah. So let me ask you, for people who may not be familiar, they hear the title, what are the responsibilities of the state controller? Do they overlap with the city controller? Does a controller decide policy in any way? Talk about it.
Good question. One I'm often asked. I always say a lot of what we do is, I guess, simply described as some of the back office operation for the state, so it may not be as visible to people, but it is very important. You're right to mention, especially for your listeners in the boroughs, New York City has its own elected controller. A couple of other counties across the state have their own elected controllers as well. So the roles are different, though. They're similar functions, but different territories. So, in other words, the city controller doesn't report to the state controller or vice versa. But some of our functions are similar. We oversee the finances, not from a policy perspective, and I'm glad you mentioned that. We don't decide how much money is being spent on which programs. But when the legislature and the governor make those decisions, we're the ones who make sure the money is spent the right way. So we approve payments. We approve contracts that businesses or vendors may have with the state, or grants that are going to nonprofits, or money going to New York City or other local governments. We audit payments, and we audit state agencies and public authorities and local governments, including some of the agencies of New York City where we have jurisdiction and the city controller does not. So that's another way that we promote accountability. And other functions I'll mention real quickly: managing the state's pension fund, which is very important for retirement security, investing the money of the pension fund, administering the oil spill fund, the 529 college savings program, the New York ABLE program to help people with disabilities have financial independence. We comment on state fiscal practices. Again, we don't make decisions on those practices, but we can, for instance, look at the state budget when it's completed, and we look long term, is the budget being in balance? And we have a separate office for New York City that looks at New York City issues that comes out of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. And that is the entity that looks at issues like the MTA, what's happening there. So we have a lot of different functions. We put out a lot of reports, a lot of audits. We try to better inform the larger community about what's going on, and certainly our work is very essential to the smooth functioning of state government.
So, Controller, elaborate on those funds that are based in the city, if I'm understanding you correctly, and yet controlled by the state. Why is there that distinction, and what are some of those funds?
What many people don't realize about the state budget is that much of it it's pass-through money, either federal money or state money that then goes to local governments, including New York City. And then you have important state entities. The MTA is a state authority, right? So obviously the MTA, the subways, the buses, the trains, all has a big impact on what's happening in New York City. But that is ultimately a state authority, and we have jurisdiction, again, not for making decisions on what the MTA does, but we provide some level of oversight as to what the MTA is doing. So there is in New York, this very complex relationship between what the state does, what the city does. Keep in mind, New York City is, in effect, a creation of New York State, right? It was formed when there was a consolidation between the city of Brooklyn and some of the towns in Queens, and then what had been traditionally New York City, which is basically Manhattan and the Bronx, and I guess Staten Island was part of that also. So in terms of as you often see when the city wants to raise revenue, they have to go to the state to get sign off. So other than the property tax, which the city does control and they impose. So there is an interconnectedness in terms of what the state authority is and what jurisdiction the city has. And there are many instances where the city has to go to the state to get approval on any number of issues. Just look at something like tenant protections, right? The Emergency Tenant Protection Act. That's a state law, yet it governs housing issues in New York City. So we have some role, again, not directly in making those decisions on those different programs and the money being spent, but so when New York City, let's say, has money going to when New York State rather has money going to the New York City Department of Education, we will look at how the Department of Education is spending that money.
So look at the MTA, because we're always hearing about the requests made by the MTA. We're hearing now about congestion pricing, which is to benefit the MTA. At the same time, we're reading about fare beaters that cost the MTA a fortune in terms of income, and yet we have to pay for that. Look at the MTA. I mean, are we on a path to being better? Are we not what we should be, and we're just stuck in this place?
Well, a couple thoughts. First of all, in terms of congestion pricing, again, that's an example of a policy area, right, that our shop had no role in. And congestion pricing was a decision as part of a state decision made a number of years ago. Fast forward to today, and now it's being implemented. After you saw the governor put a pause or a hold, and then it was changed, the level of the charge was, changed as well. So let me just comment on this as far as congestion pricing. One of the big challenges the MTA rightfully has is that they need money to fund their capital program. And, people ask me all the time, Tom, are you for congestion pricing, against congestion pricing? I said, look, I'm the state controller. I don't have a policy role in that. But I can tell you this, if the MTA's capital plan is not funded, the system runs the risk of falling into a state of poor repair. And that means not having the money to replace the old subway cars or the old buses, not having the money to make sure that the stations are compliant with ADA requirements for people with disabilities, not able to make sure that the other kinds of infrastructure of the system that people don't always see is adequately maintained. That what we learned about the problem of climate change and Superstorm Sandy and so on, not building in the resilience. You needed money to do that. Whether you agree with the decision or not, congestion pricing was put together as the way to fund the capital plan, both, particularly for the current capital plan. Now the MTA has a new capital plan that they recently announced, and that's not been signed off on yet. There's a gap in funding for that, but at least with the congestion pricing, even though the fee coming in is lower than the initial, $15 that was proposed, it should be enough for them to fill what they need to fill with the current capital plan. Bottom line is this, Rev and Rabbi, if you don't want congestion pricing, you have to come up with another funding source for the $15 billion that was needed to complete that work. So in terms of congestion pricing, there's still some lawsuits, as you know. It looks like it's going to be implemented. A lot of folks aren't happy with it. Some folks think it's going to be a good idea, not only to raise money, but also to hopefully relieve the challenge of congestion. But my main point is, and I channel my dear friend Dick Ravitch, who was the one who really saved the MTA back when it was really in a state of disrepair. you got to keep the system functioning by being in good repair.
Right.
Otherwise, it's already a problem getting people back into the trade.
Do you look at the budget of the MTA? Do you say, well, maybe, too much money is being spent in one area and could be moved?
Yeah. I mean, the short is yes. We do it through our audits. In fact, just, the past couple of weeks, we put out an audit, for instance, on their procurement policies. They were supposed to, as part of the transformation plan, right? Because the MTA is, it's different entities, right? It's the subways, it's the buses, it's the trains, it's, all different aspects that are together through the MTA. They were supposed to do a streamlining and coordination to be more efficient. And one of the areas that we looked at was their procurement, which is, how they access goods and services. We found that except for some preliminary steps, they really haven't achieved the savings through the transformation and the efficiencies that they had said they were going to achieve. Also, preparing for severe weather impacts. Again, certain indications that they were going to take steps, we found that they've fallen short. So, we don't set the MTA budget. There is a separate independent MTA board made up of appointments from the governor and the city and the counties in the MTA jurisdiction. They are the ones who set the MTA budget. But we then look at the money that the MTA is spending on these different programs. And I think it'd be fair to say, getting, the jumping off point of the question, can the MTA be doing better? Can they be more efficient? Can they realize savings? Absolutely. Absolutely. We find those opportunities. There's an MTA Inspector General that often comes out with reports as well. So look, it's a big job. I don't envy what Jan Oliba has to manage. They can be doing better. They should be doing better. Rabbi, you mentioned the fare, beaters. I mean, that's hundreds of millions of dollars. They've taken some steps. They need to do a lot more, but you can't evade from the fact that they needed a significant amount of money to be sure that they could implement their capital plan. And these questions are not done. Their new capital plan, it's somewhat up in the air as to how that's going to be finalized, but there's about a $33 billion gap in that next plan to go from 2025 to 2029. So this MTA discussion is not going away. And also, as you know, the planned increase in the fare, that's being implemented as well. So, hey, bottom line, we have no economy in the New York metro area without a functioning MTA. We're talking about money. We're talking about keeping the system in good repair. They still have issues of cleanliness, of public safety, which have certainly been in the news. There are a lot of reasons why you do not have the ridership back to where it was before the pandemic. And that's one of the big problems with the MTA's finances. They are very dependent on ridership. And until they get back to 100% or more, we're going to have a lot of these questions about how we adequately fund public transit in New York.
I'm glad you circled back to the fare beaters. I've got two questions. First question, how do you measure that? How do you measure the number of individuals who are beating the fares and then put a dollar value on it? Of course, based upon fare, the cost of the fare. But how do you measure that?
Well, I mean, we've been going by the MTA's numbers. I mean, they've been as high as $700 million. So, I haven't questioned their number. I mean, that's a pretty big number that they've come up with. But they measure. They have a way of measuring what in terms of what the census is in terms of who's there and what actually is coming into the fare box.
Our state is a tax-based economy, and there are advantages and disadvantages or challenges to that. Many people don't understand that, so they don't understand the role of taxes and how government has to levy those taxes in order to build infrastructure, provide services, et cetera. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because you're in the numbers on this.
Well, I mean, one of the challenges with that question is that, there's no doubt that New York spends more money than other states. I mean, you see that in all the analysis. Part of that is the costs generally are more expensive here. That's not new or news. But, I always say to people, they have to keep in mind that the kind of services that you get in New York State far exceed the services that you see in many other states. Is it always the level of quality that we'd like to see? No. And there's a fair amount of criticism. Again, that's why what we do with our audits, what the city controller does, currently Brad Lander with his audits, we're trying to make sure you get the best buck for the taxpayers and the money that's being spent. But I mean, I just look at, my own growing up, right? I went to public schools. How were the public schools financed? They were financed through taxes, property taxes. I grew up on Long Island, and state aid that come through largely through the state income tax that everybody has an opportunity to pay into. You look at health care. Now, the big program with the state obviously is the Medicaid program. So right away, people are going to say, well, that's only for poorer folks. Well, the reality is, one of the fast-growing parts of the Medicaid program is long-term care. Long-term care very often are middle-class families that have a loved one who needs to be in a nursing home, and folks go to the appropriate elder care lawyer, figure out how to spend down assets, protect those assets, and their parent or their grandparent ends up on the Medicaid program in a nursing home. That money is money that's raised through state taxes. Federal tax revenue comes into play here as well. But these are all different ways that I hate to put it this way, but you never know when you're going to need those state services. And certainly,
right.
we talked a lot about the MTA. For so many people to get to work, I'm not even talking about tourism or travel, day trippers. The subways and the buses and the trains are essential to people getting to a job. And more people not only just coming into the city, reverse commuters, going out to Long Island. I see it, in Great Neck where I live, the number of people coming off the train in the morning, sometimes as many people going on the train to go into the city. So all of this is not for free. What I think we need to do, though, Rev, is make sure the money is being spent in a way that people trust. And right now, I think there's a lot of skepticism that the money is not always being spent as wisely as it should be spent. And I think some of that is not without some merit.
Yeah, people don't realize that you're reinvesting these tax dollars into the public domain. Like you said, healthcare, education, infrastructure, social welfare, which is unemployment benefits, pensions, Social Security, and public safety. And they don't realize the cost that it takes, what it takes to drive these things. And often, we become very critical because of higher taxes.
Well, look, the other issue, and we've been doing reports on this, is all on our website if any of your listeners are interested. We've been looking at the recovery in New York State. I mean, the good news is we've recovered really just about all the jobs that were lost during the close down from COVID. But it's that recovery is not even all across the state. We have some regions and certainly some sectors of the economy that are not fully back. And we've been looking at New Yorkers in need, and there are still nearly 1 in 5 children in our state that live in poverty. In fact, the top 10 cities in the United States, highest child poverty rates, 3 of those top 10 are in New York State. And we're not talking about New York City. We're talking about Rochester. We're talking about Syracuse. We're talking about Buffalo. This is a statewide issue. Housing insecurity. Everybody's concerned about the issue of affordable housing. You hear about it all the time. But you've got 1 in 5 households in New York that have 50% of their income or more going towards housing. I mean, that is creating a lot of dislocation for a lot of families. So, and we see it particularly in some of the boroughs. So we're going to continue to look. Food insecurity, another issue that's out there. And so the state and the federal government, to an extent, has been the way to come in and try to solve and reverse some of these trends, particularly when you talk about families that are falling into a level of poverty. We want to see people get back on their feet. Take an issue like food insecurity. During COVID, you saw some significant expansion of benefits to help with that. Well, now some of those programs are lapsing. Can the state pick up all of that? Probably not, but hopefully the state can do a little more. We still have some real challenges. Yeah. New York still is many, many wealthy people, many, many poor people, and a lot of folks in the middle who are feeling very squeezed. That's a lot of interest to balance.
We're going to take a break here. We're talking with the controller of the state of New York, Thomas P. DiNapoli.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
We're talking with Thomas P. DiNapoli, Controller of State. Mr. Controller, there was a lot of talk about the exodus from New York, people going elsewhere, taxes are lower, right?
Glad you brought that up. Yeah.
And what do you say to that? Are we in?
It's real. It's real. It's real in a couple ways. First of all, and there's always a lag in the data. So I guess the good news is that we saw certainly a significant spike during COVID, and obviously some of that had to do with the fact that people didn't want to be in the city, right? So some of that migration was from New York City to Hudson Valley and Long Island, and some of it obviously was going out of state, particularly down south. Some of that migration has now reversed. However, in our latest data, and we're trying to update the numbers, we still have a net loss, particularly for taxpayers at the upper end. And that's important because, the rough numbers, the top 2% of taxpayers in our state pay for, close to 50% of the personal income tax revenue. So you don't want to lose the taxpayers that help pay for all those programs we've been talking about. But the larger number actually has been folks at the lower end of the income. Why? Because of the affordability issue. They're not leaving because they already have a home in Florida and they're just changing their tax address and still keeping a place in New York. They're leaving because they can't afford to stay here anymore. And this, of course, has resulted in us losing congressional seats over the years, losing political clout. So, immigration, not just the recent discussion of migrants, but immigration broadly has, to a certain extent, offset some of that. But we've still seen too many New Yorkers leaving. That is not a trend that we want to see continue.
But Tom, you see younger people or a number of people coming in and renting apartments, $5,000 a month, $6,000 a month.
You wonder how they do it, right?
Yeah, and that doesn't offset the loss of that 2% you mentioned earlier.
No, not necessarily. No, but because particularly for the city, obviously hot neighborhoods like some of them, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and so on, and even the Bronx is becoming hot, and Queens, Staten Island too. Let's not leave them out. This is part of what is also keeping up the rental prices and generally the cost of housing. So this is still the place where people want to be. This is why you should never bet against New York. In terms of creative people looking to make their mark on the world, they want to be in New York. And so then this gets to the issue of the scarcity of housing. And the city just went through this process. The city council did pass the mayor's City of Yes initiative. This issue of housing, obviously the governor's talked about it. Another issue that's not easily resolved, not going to go away, but there's obviously more discussion than ever about how we create more supply of housing. You have to have the supply to meet the demand. And I must say, it's not just a New York City issue. We're seeing it in other parts of the state as well.
Right. I'm serving on a City Charter Revision Commission, and we start meeting, in fact, this month to take a look at the City Charter. And I think it's going to be very effective, especially around the city policies on affordable housing. So I'm excited about that. Governor, talk about, I'm Governor.
Wait a second. There's something Rev, there's something you want to share. Tom, you want to announce something?
But the reason is because, we started a church back in 1990. It's one of the largest churches in central New York, located in Syracuse. So I'm in touch with what's happening in central New York and throughout the state itself. Micron won a $6.1 billion microchip grant for a plant there. They're talking about 10,000 jobs. We're also looking at the support systems that will service not just the 10,000 people working for Micron, but another 40,000 people to support to work for the supportive services that are going to come up. So we're looking at housing, we're looking at shopping centers and retail and commercial spaces and whatnot. How involved are you in something like that in terms of the impact that it's going to have on our state economically?
We've certainly been monitoring it. That's been more an initiative, the governor has really, taken the lead on in terms of championing. And, credit to Chuck Schumer, the federal government also, particularly with Chuck's initiative, has delivered money to make sure that Micron will follow through on what they've put out there. What we'll look at are ways in which either state support or local support, local economic development dollars, to the extent that they will be used to help ensure that the goal of Micron, in fact, will be realized. We'll look at that. And, we've done a lot of audits on this whole area of economic development dollars, how the money's spent. We look at IDAs, industrial development agencies, how they are providing incentives, usually tax breaks, right, for economic development. So in terms of Micron on the front end, we've had no particular role, but to the extent that there will be state dollars as part of economic development or infrastructure investment, we would look at that and make sure money's being spent appropriately. And we did actually call on Micron, because we're a shareholder of Micron through our pension fund, to make sure that as they are creating these jobs, that they are talking to labor, that they have a good policy as far as labor relations, and so we did weigh in on that. But at this point, we'll look to see how it's being implemented, and we'll have some role in that, I'm sure.
Mr. Controller, you mentioned pension funds, and whenever we have you, and I always take a moment to thank you, because New York State has been a strong investor in the state of Israel, with pension funds being invested in the state of Israel. And given what's going on today, what's your take on those investments? How sound are they? I mean, I've always invested in Israel bonds. I think it's one of the best investments you can make. Yeah.
Well, we've had a long history of investing with Israel bonds, and I have to say, since October 7th, we've continued to invest in Israel bonds. I'm very proud of the fact that New York has been a leading state in terms of investing in Israel bonds. Why? It's a good, safe return. That's got to be my objective as trustee for the fund. But certainly, I think the historic connection that New York has felt to Israel, we put our money where our heart is, and so we continue that. I should also mention that our investments in other sectors of the Israeli economy, particularly through some of our private equity funds, the whole discussion of Startup Nation and the tech center and medical technology. Israel has been an incredible incubator in terms of businesses that not only provide a profit, but very often create jobs here in the U.S., right? Israel's a rather small market, so you get an Israeli startup company. Very often they will locate their jobs and part of their marketing right here in the U.S., right here in New York often. So yes, I mean, the short answer is we've had a long history of investing in Israel. Obviously, all the turmoil in that part of the world, we want to hopefully see 2025 be a year of peace, but we have not wavered in our commitment. And again, I think it's been the right thing to do, but it also has done well in terms of our pension fund investing. I'm very proud of the fact that our state pension fund is one of the best funded in the entire country, and part of that is our smart investments in Israel.
Excellent. So let me engage your prophetic imagination here, Comptroller. Economic outlook for New York State over the next 5-10 years.
I think in the short run, it's good. I think the good news is, one of the backdrops, obviously, to a good state economy is having the state's finances be in good order. And what we're seeing now, keep in mind our fiscal year goes to March 31st, so we still have a couple months left. But the tax revenue is coming in higher than projected. So all this talk about people leaving, we're still collecting more money than we had thought we would. So that's good news. But there are some out-year budget gaps. They are manageable given the size of the state budget. So I believe the state finances are in good shape. We still see certain regions of the state that are struggling to get back to where they were before COVID. The Southern Tier area, the North Country, I'll point to those two regions particularly as struggling. New York City has grown back all the jobs that were lost and added some. You saw the reports just in the past week or so about tourism. Now looks like it'll be back to pre-COVID numbers sometime in 2025. So I'm seeing good signs. It's not a perfect picture, though. We still see certain sectors of the economy, manufacturing, construction, retail, still have some struggles out there. You look in the city, the central business district in Manhattan, there's more return to work, but a lot of the office space still is not fully utilized. That has an impact then on the retail, on the restaurants, and so on. That's been a struggle. So, my optimism, my prophetic optimism continues to be there, but it's not without struggles, and we need to be mindful of making smart choices about particularly how we do invest as far as economic development, but also how we're spending the people's money. There is not an unlimited amount of taxpayer money out there. Government needs to be smarter about how we're spending the taxpayer dollars.
Mr. Comptroller, I mentioned earlier, and you've touched on it, there was cooperation when you went into office with people on different sides of the aisle. That atmosphere has changed. You don't see the kind of necessary collaboration that you witnessed years ago. What happened? How did this all fall apart?
Well, I wish more people would go to hear you, Rabbi, and to go to Christian Cultural Center. Maybe that would help. A little more of the faith and the spirit. Obviously, this is something that's been evolving over time. Look, there was always partisanship and always challenges, but I do think, not to repeat the thing that so many people say, social media has not helped. The immediacy of discussions and having to have an opinion on everything, and every rumor gets posted and blogged and suddenly, becomes truth. And people living in their own echo chambers, we do not have a common source of information anymore. And so you only trust the information from your chosen source, which tends to not necessarily be so objective. And so the news tends to be skewed to whatever your point of view is. And so if you're not, there's always been different opinions, but if you're not even agreeing on the facts, how do you have a reasonable discussion? And I think that has contributed to the polarization, and I do think it's unfortunate. But you also see it, within the parties. I mean, obviously, in my party, the Democratic Party, you do have that tension between however you want to define it, right? The far left and the centrist, or whatever, labels sometimes I think are not always appropriate to what really is going on. But you certainly have conflict within the Democratic Party. You saw that in the Republican Party as well, right? The primary started out with many candidates and a lot of dissension. I mean, coalesced around Trump in the end, but I think you see a more polarized, not just between Republicans and Democrats, but even within the parties, more polarization, and you have many people now that choose not to be in either party, particularly younger people, and so there's been an overall weakening of the traditional role of the two parties to kind of be the arbiters of building a consensus, and I think that fractured political dynamic is going to continue. I don't see that abating, and hopefully folks of the old-fashioned era like myself will still have some place in all that, and because I do think you need to figure out how to find common ground, not compromise core values, but need to have common ground. So I think, as I probably discussed on your show in the past, I grew up in a Republican family. My parents, grandparents, all Republicans. I never could look at someone in the other party and say, "Oh, you're intrinsically no better than you're worse off than me because you're not in my party." I can't view that. There are some people that have that attitude, and how do you get to a compromise if you have that attitude?
Yeah.
Right. Comptroller, you levy taxes on, not you, but I mean, New York State's economy, we levy taxes on individuals, business, property, goods, services. To what degree does the sector of philanthropy in New York, how philanthropic are we as a state? Or is that under your purview?
Well, it's not directly under our purview. Actually, charities is under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General. But I can tell you that we're putting out a report. It's not quite done yet, but on the not-for-profit sector, which is where a lot of the charitable money goes. The not-for-profit sector is a big part of the state's economy, both in terms of jobs and in terms of services provided. People don't realize, we talk about a lot of things that government does. Well, a lot of what government does is gives a contract to a nonprofit who actually does the service, and often does it more effectively than if government was doing it directly. So I would answer your question, Rev, by saying that nonprofit sector is particularly strong in New York State, stronger than on many measures than many other, if not every other state in the union, because of the generosity of individuals. And certainly that's, again, why we want our higher income folks to stay here, because they tend to be the ones that have more money to give back to charity, but also because of the generosity of government. Yeah. When government is making a contract with a nonprofit, it's tax dollars that are being put back into a direct service. So, yeah, we are a generous state, and people may fault us for that, but in the end, I think that has made us a better state.
One last question, because we've come almost to the end of the segment. Mr. Controller, state universities, you monitor them, how they spend their monies, where the monies are coming from?
SUNY and CUNY, we do audits there, very much so. Again, that's a very important resource. Community colleges as well. They've been facing some challenges. They've had enrollment declines. Actually, more recent numbers, CUNY's numbers are up. Some of the SUNY campuses are up. But, they have that challenge of a lot of fixed costs and many of the campuses declining enrollment. So they've had to cut back on programs. We in our state, we've actually had, I think, about 4 or 5 private colleges closed in our state. People don't realize that. These were smaller colleges, largely based upstate. That hasn't happened with SUNY or CUNY yet, but there certainly has been some curtailment of programs. So, again, making sure they're spending their money wisely.
And where the money comes from? Do you look at where the money comes from as well?
Well, again, some of that's tax dollars, but a lot of that is driven by tuition. So it's a combination of factors there.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thomas
Excellent
P. DiNapoli.
But remind everybody to look for unclaimed funds, even if they don't take Reverend Bernard's unclaimed funds.
I have been a recipient of unclaimed funds.
So have I.
Good news is there's a new law that just got signed by the governor for new accounts, $250 or less. Instead of having to come to us, we will send the check directly when we can get a valid address and a valid contact. So that's going to be good news for people on unclaimed funds.
All right. So there's Potasnik without a C. You know that, Tom. Yeah, you got it.
I'm not sure how to spell it. I got to double check that.
All right. I think listening to
Happy New Year.
Hey, by the way, Tom,
you and your listeners.
Listening to you today, and I think Reverend Bernard agrees with me. I think all of us feel a little bit better knowing that you're there and that you're overseeing so many of these different components of the controller's office. There's a sense of comfort. You know what you're doing, and we're all the better for it.
Well, you're very kind.
Absolutely, and it speaks to why he's been there for the period of time. He has the confidence of the people, and that should continue.
Thank you both.
So thank you for the great job that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate each of your leadership, and I love listening to your show on Sunday morning. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, my friend. And stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on 77 WABC. We'll be right back.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Talk Radio 77 WABC and the all-new WABCRadio.com.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
I tell you, it was a very informative conversation, and I think it's a message that before people criticize, get the facts. Look at the numbers. Get the information before you jump to that conclusion.
Yeah. It's unfortunate we don't engage in critical thinking, and the first step in critical thinking is questioning. What was really said? What's really going on? What are the facts?
Yeah.
Understand that, and then we can analyze.
Yeah, exactly.
But we don't get the facts. We get opinions and ideas and in our echo chambers, and it just goes on and on. So we never get to really analyze and evaluate something that's true. So it's really tough, Rabbi.
It's like you draw the target, right? You actually you shoot, and then you draw the target around
yeah,
right?
Around, yeah.
Where you want it to be rather than where it should be.
Yeah, but
Rev,
it was a great program.
Yep.
I think our audience got a lot out of it. I know that I did, and you did along the way. But it's always great having our Comptroller DiNapoli
All right.
on the
Thank
show with us.
Ava Anderson, thank you so much for being so much a part of it.
To our engineer. Until next time, the Rev and the Rabbi will be back here next Sunday, same time, 7 a.m. on 77 WABC. Till then, God bless.